Hi everybody, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, and that is the 29th of September. What we are doing is putting some closure onto Frankenstein, our first major Gothic text. And that means that our first journal is going to be due soon because our first journal is going to be about Frankenstein. You remember I had indicated that the journals are meant to be an informal response to the readings that we're doing over the course of the semester. So I don't have any particular guidelines or template. I'm not evaluating the journals for grammar or for mechanics, just for content. Think of it as a conversation on paper, a place where you can indicate your observations, your thoughts, your reflections, and your questions. More than plot, though plot is important initially in terms of our understanding the text, but we've been moving beyond plot and trying to talk about not just what is happening, but why those things happen to be occurring. So your first journal on Frankenstein will be due on Wednesday the 29th. If you're watching this video on Wednesday, that happens to be today. At 11:59 p.m., I asked because of my grading program that you submit it to me via my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu, and you send that via PDF. And then what I will do is put some comments on that, again, as if we were having a conversation on paper. I grade informally on a checkmark system, and then I will return that back to your email. And your second journal, which won't be due for a little while, will be on the next set of readings, which happens to be Edgar Allan Poe. But for now, we're still on Frankenstein. And I've been talking a good amount about the iconic Hollywood film of the 1930s and how that helped influence popular culture and our understanding of the text. But Mary Shelley gave us a very different kind of text because she had very different concerns than just trying to entertain or to profit. There are a good number of morals and messages that are embedded within Frankenstein. And if you'll remember how Stephen King talked about how Gothic tales oftentimes are morality tales, they are meant to teach us lessons. I think we very much see that with someone like Mary Shelley. In fact, we'll see that throughout the entire semester. And where we left off was talking about the transition of the text from Walton's tale. Of course, that's being told, or the transition of the text from Walton's letters, which is how the text begins, to the story of Victor, which is translated through Walton in his letters, to now the story of the creature, which supposedly is translated through Victor, which is translated through Walton in his letters. So we have these multiple narratives. And chapter 9 is where we are presented with this incredibly articulate creature, which is the exact opposite of what Hollywood supplies us with. And many morals or lessons are embedded within the creation of this creature. The creature appreciates nature, and what we see throughout the text is when the characters isolate themselves from nature and the natural order, horrible consequences result. The creature engages in benevolent activities. So the creature is thinking about and concerned with the welfare of others above his own welfare. Another lesson or more within the text. The creature teaches itself language. So certainly ambition and intellect are important, but we can see through Victor how ambition and intellect can be misused and abused, almost like that Dr. Faustus character I've been talking about over the past couple classes, who wants unlimited knowledge and the negative consequences that result because of that in that great Renaissance play by Christopher Marlowe. And the creature is able to draw parallels between itself and some major literary works, specifically Paradise Lost. You'll remember that the text begins with Paradise Lost, or a quote from Paradise Lost, and the creature sees how it has commonalities with both Adam, who was created solo without a mate, and that'll be important as the text progresses, and also to Satan, who is created and basically exiled and rejected by its creator, and that also has parallels as well. And when we move forward and we learn about the DeLacy family, which happens to be a subplot that oftentimes is deleted from Hollywood narratives, again, because it's not necessary in terms of the tale itself, but it is necessary in Shelley's narrative to reinforce the idea of the importance of appearance and that this creature is rejected solely because of external characteristics, not because of its temperament or behavior, at least initially in the tale. And that's best illustrated through having a blind patriarch, and that he actually has the opportunity to befriend the creature in a way no one else does, because he has not been soiled by the prejudices and the stereotypes of society if he can't see. But his family just happens to come in at the moment that the creature is pleading his case, and of course the family rejects the creature, which means that ultimately, once again, the creature is alone. So Victor's created something for his own benefit. He's abandoned this, and he's created something that cannot integrate into the world. So obviously, we see that in many ways this is a narrative about parenthood and what happens, first of all, when you try to create life unnaturally, which is what Victor does. Secondly, when you try to create life without female, and that's also what Victor does. And thirdly, when you create life and you don't take responsibility for that life. Now, the creature in chapter 13 has a very interesting quote where he says, "Was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and base?" And the answer is, oh yeah. And we see this throughout the text. I mean, think about the idea of the DeLacy family, how they're suffering because they themselves have been exiled. And then what do? They exile this creature from the possibility of companionship. And we get this long, convoluted tale about the Lacey family, and some of it is just to move forward plot. So there is a character named Safie, who is being taught language by the DeLacy family. So this is a happy coincidence for the creature, because the creature can eavesdrop on these language lessons. Safie's mother was a Christian Arab, and basically taught Safie to aspire to the higher powers of intellect and independence of spirit, forbidden to the female followers of Muhammad. So that's a quote from chapter 14. So we definitely see the Christian bias within this particular text. And we also get this narrative about how Safie's father loathed the idea that his father, or that his daughter, should be united to a Christian, which is part of the plot that occurs in that supposedly Safie's father has committed some sort of crime against the government, and then basically a member of the DeLacy family is so outraged that he tries to defend Safie's father, and at one point Safie's father suggests that the member of the family, Felix, can be rewarded through his beautiful daughter, happens to be Safie, if Felix is able to secure his release. Things don't go well. And then basically the result is that Felix is double-crossed, and he ultimately has to exile himself with his family, a family that at once lived with a certain level of privilege and now is living on a certain level of poverty. And I had talked about how this text oftentimes examines isms like classism or racism or sexism. Now, of course, the creature, coincidentally, is able to find out all of this, because after he was created in the laboratory, it turns off that when he ran off with one of Victor's jackets, all of this was detailed in some letters and some papers from the laboratory, and was in the actual pocket of the jacket. Again, we probably have to suspend some disbelief here, but it also illustrates the idea of the epistolary novel, and how much of this novel is told through written narrative, and how much of the characters learn through written narrative, which was the last attendance question I had asked you. What are the strengths and weaknesses of that kind of narrative? Or if nothing else, did you like or dislike that particular approach to telling narrative? And the creature, after it details all of this, it talks about how there is no one in the world to help it. So that ultimately it's only Victor who can, as its creator, offer the creature at least some companionship. And in chapter 19, I want to draw your attention to this quote. Victor says, "I felt as if I had committed some great crime. I was guiltless, but I had indeed drawn down a horrible curse upon my head." Might I suggest that Victor is anything but guiltless? He continues to say this over and over over and over in the text, as if he's guilty, or he feels as if he's guilty. And of course he's guilty, and he's guilty on multiple levels. But In this instance, we're left with a philosophical question about what do you do when you have a creation that you have created so that there is no possibility for it to be integrated in society. The creation says that the only thing to do would be to create a mate, much like Adam was created a mate like God so that he wouldn't be filled with loneliness. And we can certainly understand the creature's perspective in this instance because certainly no one wants to be isolated, and that's one of the catches that or catchphrases that you'll find in the Gothic, that isolation will result in negative consequences. And Victor struggles with this, and he tries to rationalize why he should or should not follow the requests of the creature. And he doesn't follow the requests of the creature ultimately. He abandons his creation. Of course, the creature has been pursuing Victor. Notice how pursuit and retreat is a major element in this particular text. And as a result of Victor's actions, the creature declares, I shall be with you on your wedding night. And Victor, being filled with such self-centeredness, assumes that the threat is against him. Never once does he consider that the threat could be against Elizabeth, which ultimately is what happens. The best way to hurt somebody is really to hurt the people that they love. So this, after the murder of Elizabeth, leads to the consequences of ultimately Clerval, being Victor's best friend, also being murdered. And the relationship between Victor and Clerval is very interesting. They're quite close. In fact, they're closer in many ways than Victor is with Elizabeth. Now, we could argue that perhaps that has something to do with the idea that Victor and Elizabeth are supposed to be part of an arranged marriage. But nevertheless, they know each other quite well, and they've been reared together with these expectations. And in fact, there have been individuals who have read this text and have wondered if there are some sort of homoerotic tendencies between Victor and Clerval. One of the reasons why Victor continually delays having a marriage with Elizabeth, and one of the reasons why it seems that Victor has a closer relationship. Now, Victor has a closer relationship with Clerval. Now, during the time of the Romantic period, it wasn't necessarily unusual for male friendships to be close and not necessarily have to have some sort of sexual connotation to them. But certainly when we have a text that seems to negate female, and we have a text in which child is created without female, one does have to wonder about any kind of sexual inferences that Shelley might have embedded within the text. Regardless, though, Elizabeth and Clerval are the two closest people to Victor. So the creature has learned that this is the best way that he can enact revenge against Victor. And of course, we find out earlier on that the creature has learned through the evils of humanity how to commit murder, how to basically frame an individual, which is what the creature does with Justine. When the creature comes across Victor's younger brother and realizes that this is a family relation of Victor, so the creature kills William. And then it just so happens that it finds a way that it can frame Justine for the crime. And we talked about, and this is in the earlier part of the text, that Justine ultimately accepts blame, in part because of the pressure she feels about being excommunicated and burning in hell. And while that would be true of all Christians, I suggest that's also particularly true of female, who was thought of as particularly susceptible to evil. And it's one of the arguments that's been made in Christianity that it was Eve herself that was the more frail of the Adam and Eve pair, because she was the first to succumb to the temptation of Satan, temptation of forbidden knowledge. And note how that is also embedded within the text, with Victor seeking out forbidden knowledge. And then after all of this, we finally return back to Walton and his letters. It would be very easy at this particular point to forget that we are reading a narrative about Walton. So Shelley's very deliberate in terms of bringing us back to the original frame. And here, supposedly, is where Victor talks about that he has been chasing the creature through these horrific conditions. Note the extremes we're oftentimes presented with in this novel. For instance, fire and ice. And this is definitely a novel about extremes and about the consequences, the negative consequences of extreme. But nevertheless, this is where Victor is picked up by Walton's crew, and Walton is so happy to have another European with him, again illustrating Shelley's bias. And Victor is supposedly telling Walton his tale. And also, Walton is in the midst of a mutinous crew, because Walton himself has lots of parallels to Victor in terms of trying to seek out forbidden knowledge. And even though this is all supposed to be a cautionary tale from Victor, telling Walton not to follow in Victor's footsteps of arrogance and hubris, in chapter 24, Victor says to Walton's mutinous crew at one point, "Be men, or be more than men. Be steady to your purposes and firm as a rock." In other words, at this point, he's encouraging the crew not to turn around. So this is very typical of Victor. He continues to vacillate. He says he's responsible, then he says he's not responsible. He says that he's learned a lesson to not be arrogant, but then he displays arrogance. He talks about how he wants to teach people to not necessarily pursue forbidden avenues, but then he encourages them to pursue forbidden avenues. So Victor is not a character who learns through this tale. If anybody learns anything through this tale, perhaps it's Walton, because Walton ultimately decides to turn around from his voyage. And I guess the bigger hope and point is that we as reader would learn something from this particular tale. Now, ultimately, Victor dies, and then the creature has a closing dialogue with Walton in chapter 24, saying, "Impotent envy and bitter indignation filled me with an insatiable thirst for vengeance. I was the slave, not the master, of an impulse which I detested, yet could not disobey." Again, one of the ideas in the text, as I had suggested earlier, servitude and mastery, and who or what has servitude and who or what has mastery. And in this particular instance, we can say that the text ends with our having more of a sympathetic feeling towards the creature than we could ever have towards Victor. And granted, the creature has engaged in some pretty terrible deeds. But as the creature indicates, it has engaged in these actions because first it's learned how to engage in evil because of humanity, and secondly that humanity pushed into this point. It almost reminds me very much of a play by William Shakespeare entitled The Tempest, which you might be familiar with, and it happens to be about a shipwreck that occurs because of a tempest or a huge storm. And then all of these individuals are shipwrecked in various parts of the island. And then it turns out that one of these individuals is named Caliban. And this is a magical island, so he is this deformed creature of a witch, the offspring of a witch. And he is discovered on this island by someone else who was shipwrecked on the island years earlier. And Caliban is a native inhabitant of the island. He wasn't part of the original or the secondary shipwreck. And the first shipwreck, the individual who was shipwrecked, his name was Ferdinand, basically utilized Caliban's skills, but then took advantage of them and imprisoned Caliban. And in many ways, that text has been viewed as a commentary on conquering European to native indigenous population, represented by Caliban as native indigenous population. But the reason why I mention Caliban is because he has a very interesting quote in the play where he talks about that Ferdinand taught him language, the idea that this was an attempt to civilize him, because again, remember, he was the offspring of a witch. And the result of it was that, well, he learned how to curse. And I always think about this with the creature, and that the creature is given life, but yet the creature isn't given any kind of guidance or any kind of support. And these are the consequences that result. And I even suggested that perhaps this could be a commentary on what happens in our own society when parent doesn't necessarily give support to child. At the ending, the creature says it's going to commit suicide, basically saying that there is no reason for it to continue on because now that its creator, its father, if you will, is gone, that there really isn't any point to life. So in chapter 24, saying, "I shall collect my funeral pile and consume to ashes this miserable frame." And we assume that he does that. Of course, we've got an open ending so that if we wanted to have a sequel, and Hollywood has jumped on this idea, you can have a sequel. We don't have a sequel for Mary Shelley, and I'm grateful actually that we don't, because I've seen too many sequels that are poorly done. So rather just to leave it there, and with a creature that it would seem is going to take responsibility for its actions. Now, the attendance question that I wanted you to consider for today was specifically about the creature's request for a companion. Do you think that Victor should have created a female for the creature, and why? We certainly know the consequences of Victor not creating a female for the creature, but Victor, of course, rationalizes that if he were to create a female for the creature, they could be both monstrous and create havoc on society and civilization, or that the creature could find itself rejected by the female and be more embittered. But those seem to be more like excuses than rationalizations. And I think that there are consequences certainly to creating a female that go beyond that. For instance, as we think about the idea of how gender is portrayed in this particular novel, and we can see parallels with the creature demanding a life being created for itself, purely for its own self-benefit without thoughts about the life itself. That said, certainly the idea of a creature that has no companionship is one that we can realize is an unnatural creation from Victor. So there is no right or wrong answer to this, much like there are no right or wrong answers to most of the, if not all of the, attendance questions that I've asked. But do you think Victor should have created a female for the creature, and why? That'll be due on Thursday the 30th at 8 a.m. And then what I wanted to do next class was to finish up with perhaps a few quotes from Frankenstein, and then to introduce Edgar Allan Poe, very famous Gothic writer. And you'll remember that Lovecraft thought quite highly of Poe. In fact, devoted an entire chapter to Poe in supernatural horror in literature. So we'll see whether or not, from at least our brief readings of Poe, that we agree or disagree with Lovecraft's assessment of Poe. I've selected just a few of Poe's short stories for The Fall of the House of Usher. That's probably the longest of the short stories, and perhaps the more complex of the four. The Mask of the Red Death, which I think that is quite timely in today's world. And once you read that text, I think you'll understand what I mean. The Telltale Heart and the Black Cat, and both are quite similar and oftentimes are done at the high school level, so perhaps you've had experience with this. And I also want to talk about writing papers. But you'll remember that last class I had indicated that I had a handout that I had put up about suggested paper topics. Now, we won't have a paper due for a while in the semester, approximately midway through the semester. But now that we are close to finishing the first journal, I wanted to introduce at least the idea of a paper and read to you the handout that I have in the syllabus and other documents folder that says paper number 1 and paper number 2, which will be due towards the ending of the semester, are meant to be critical papers. In other words, you shouldn't be consulting outside resources and do a research paper. That said, if you have your heart set on a research paper, let me know. We can perhaps negotiate. But the idea of this class, or part of the idea of this class, is that you can learn to analyze and interpret the text yourself. Of course, with the support of your classmates and myself through our discussions about the text. Paper length, I'm thinking somewhere in the area of 4 to 5 pages, but as long or short as it needs to be for you to write a good paper. And what I've done is I've just selected topics that we've already talked about in class that you will oftentimes find within the Gothic as ideas that you could pursue. I haven't found a thesis for you because that's your job, basically, to find the specific position you are going to say about a particular topic. So you can choose any of these topics listed, or you can write on your own topic, and I encourage you to do that. If you choose to write on your own topic, you should discuss the topic with me. And in fact, it's not necessarily a bad idea to discuss the topic regardless. And you can use the journals in that way to sort of try out ideas, if you so wanted to, for possibilities for the paper. And my thinking is that the the first paper, paper number 1, would address one of the earlier works and authors of the semester. So something like Frankenstein or Edgar Allan Poe or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which happens to be the text afterwards. While paper number 2, which would be due towards the ending of the semester, would address one of the later works of the semester, something like Lovecraft, The Haunting of Hill House, or The Exorcist. We're also reading Dracula, which tends to kind of straddle both the first and the second part of the semester, so you can make decisions as to whether or not that would be more appropriate for the first part, probably more appropriate for the second, just in terms of how our reading due dates will be going. And you certainly, what you don't want to do is have 2 papers devoted to the same text, but paper number 1 and paper number 2 are basically very similar. And some of the themes that I've selected are things like power. Think about how power has played a role, just like I was suggesting with servitude and mastery, in something like Frankenstein, and how ambition and desire and egomania and monomania can take over one's humility and one's reason and rationality. Violence, and that's something that we can expect to see in the Gothic, because it oftentimes examines the deviant or that which is taboo in society. The other, with a capital O, that which is different from ourselves. For instance, how the creature is so different from Victor and humanity that it's seen as other. And again, the other can apply to lots of different things in our current society and many of our social ills, such as racism and classism and sexism. Death and or rebirth. And in fact, if you wanted to think about the creature, in some ways it is a kind of rebirth. The supernatural, that which defies the natural order. Sanity and or madness. And we were talking about the epistolary novel, and that if it were indeed the case that this was all a figment of Walton's imagination, we could say that he is really dancing on the edge of madness. Certainly we can say that even if this is not a figment of Walton's imagination, Victor is turned mad through his pursuit. And perhaps even the creature is turned mad to the point where it murders. Creationism, which is somewhat related to the idea of rebirth. The unknown. Darkness. Pursuit and or retreat. We're going to be seeing a lot of chase scenes. It isn't just Victor and his creature. We'll be seeing this in Dracula as well. Fear and or desire. And we oftentimes desire that which we fear. Egotism and monomania. And when I think of egotism and monomania, the first name that comes into my head happens to be Victor Frankenstein. The second happens to be Walton. Victimization, and oftentimes female is presented as victim. Note how often that Victor is given seemingly female characteristics in this text. That not only is he being victimized, but he's subject to ill health, he's swooning, he's swaying, which I think also is quite interesting, that it's illustrative of the idea of how ultimately his pursuit has reduced him into an individual that has no power or strength. The wilderness, and think about the root of that word, wild, untamed, something that it cannot be controlled by the natural order, which perhaps we see through many of the nature images that are portrayed in the text. The forbidden, as I was suggesting with the taboo. Repression, and this is going to be particularly important as we continue on with our text. This is the Victorian period, which was highly known for its repressive attitudes, especially for sexual repression. And I think that's perhaps best illustrated in something like Dracula, but also Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Sin, and of course the idea of religion and Christianity is firmly embedded in the Frankenstein text, and we will see that in Dracula as well. Hunger and or thirst, and the idea for the desire for more, which we see both literally and figuratively, again in a text like Dracula. Evil, lust, and this is oftentimes related to the repression that I was mentioning earlier, the lust, irrationality, and chaos and or disorder. Just a few of the many themes that are often illustrated in the Gothic. So in terms of writing the paper, you'll see that I had indicated that you should use the MLA system of parenthetical documentation when quoting from a text. And an example can be found below when I actually quote from some of the text in the paper assignment that I'm going to be distributing next class, when I review some of the qualities for what makes up a good paper. So you'll be able to see examples of that. And the syllabus has exact formatting specifications, which basically means typed, double-spaced, 1-inch margins, 12-point type, with a cover page that lists the title, your name, my name, the due date. Again, all of this is in the syllabus, but I will also review this when I talk next class about some of the conventions of writing a paper, and also introduce the idea of Edgar Allan Poe, and how ultimately we could quote not necessarily just from Frankenstein, but quote from Poe, and see how many of the themes that I've already addressed can be illustrated in Poe's own works as well. So we'll continue to talk about this as the semester progresses with your first paper, but I wanted you to at least have that in the back of your mind about some possibilities that you could pursue. And actually, even at the bottom of the paper that I had distributed today about paper topics, I've got a quote for you to consider, that a good question to ask yourself when you are writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, quote, have I, and then you can see in square brackets, or has the author, and then close square brackets, said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible. And I close the quote, and in parentheses, I've got the author's last name, Biddle, the page number 9, and then I close the parentheses, and then I've got my closing punctuation. So this is also an example of the use of the MLA system of parenthetical documentation, where basically after a quote, and the quote should be verbatim, that you are putting in parentheses the pieces of information that are necessary for the reader in order to be able to identify where that quote occurs. And all of this works through a works cited page that appears at the ending of a paper, where you are listing all of your sources in alphabetical order with all of the detail of all of those sources, such as the place of publication and the publisher, so that you could look up if I did hand in a paper where I was quoting from Biddle 9, that at the ending of the paper on the works cited page, we could go down to the B section and find the surname Biddle, as well as the first name, the text, the place of publication, the publisher, and all of the rest, so that we could verify the quote that I just read to you. And the square brackets that I read to you is a grammatical convention that we use when we are quoting and we are inserting in our own language. So anything in a square bracket within a quote is not the part of the original quote. And the other convention that we use is the ellipsis, the 3 periods, to illustrate when we are leaving something out of a quote. But again, I'll talk about this in greater depth next class, as well as Edgar Allan Poe, and put some closure onto Frankenstein with a few quotes. So I look forward to receiving your journals, and thank you to those of you who have already submitted in your journals. And again, today's attendance question happens to be about the creation of this female, which is quite the philosophical and existential question. Do you think Victor should have created a female for the creature, and why or why not? And you can see also that I've indicated in the notes below that after we're done talking about Edgar Allan Poe, we have a couple of classes devoted to him. We will have a holiday coming up on the 11th of October, Indigenous Peoples Day. And then we will move to our next text, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So ideally, and again, I know life oftentimes is not ideal. Ideally, you've not only finished reading Frankenstein, but you are now reading the 4 Edgar Allan Poe stories. And very soon, within the next several days, you will be starting the next major text of the semester, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So that while we are talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you've already completed reading that, and you're on to the next text. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about some of the great authors in Gothic literature. Bye-bye.